I'll never forget what I saw that morning. My husband, Robert, was in our guest room with my son's fiancée, Sarah. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a full-on intimate scene that froze me in the doorway. As I turned to leave, I saw my son, Richard, standing in the hallway. His face was ashen. "Mom," he whispered, "this has been going on for months, and there's something you still don't know." But before I continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love to know how far our stories are reaching. My name is Ellen. I'm 65 years old, and I thought I was living the best years of my life. Robert and I built a little bed and breakfast together in a small town in Vermont that was finally starting to thrive after decades of hard work. Our son, Richard, who was 32, had just returned from Italy after getting his master's degree in culinary arts and was about to marry Sarah, a young chef he'd met during his studies. That Friday in September, the wedding was set for 2 weeks from now. The flowers had already been chosen, the menu was finalized, and the invitations had been sent. I woke up early, like I always do, to get breakfast ready for our guests. Our B&B is small, only 8 rooms, but we pride ourselves on the personal touch. The smell of fresh biscuits and gravy filled the kitchen as I poured water for the coffee. Sarah had arrived the night before for some final dress alterations. She was staying in the guest room in the main house, separate from the B&B, while Richard was staying at his apartment in the city until the wedding. Robert, who usually helped me with breakfast, was strangely absent that morning. He must be fixing a plumbing issue, I thought to myself. He was always good at fixing things. I finished arranging the fresh fruit platters and decided to go look for him. The house was quiet, except for the distant sound of voices coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. I thought maybe Sarah was awake, chatting with Robert about the wedding plans. As I got closer, I realized the voices were coming from the guest room. The door was ajar. I don't know what made me pause before I knocked. Maybe the tone of their voices, maybe an instinct I didn't know I possessed. Through the crack, I saw something I never in my life imagined I would see. Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed, with Sarah standing between his legs. His hands were on her waist, under the silk nightgown I had given her myself as a welcome gift to the family. They were kissing deeply, with a familiarity that suggested this was not the first time. "The guests will be here in an hour," he whispered, his voice hoarse in a way I knew well after so many years together. "We can't be late." "Just a little more," she replied, unbuttoning his shirt. "Richard won't be back until tonight." My son's name on her lips as she was touching my husband felt like a dagger to my heart. I backed away, instinctively, my hand covering my mouth to muffle the sound that threatened to escape. That's when I noticed Richard standing silently at the end of the hallway, watching me. Our eyes met in a moment of devastating mutual understanding. He knew. He had also found out, and from the look on his face, he had known for some time. He silently motioned for me to follow him to the back patio, away from Robert and Sarah's ears. My knees were shaking so much I could barely walk. When we got to the cold morning air, silent tears were streaming down my face. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice almost unrecognizable even to myself. "3 months," Richard replied, his voice calm, controlled, but his eyes revealed a deep pain. I found messages on his phone. At first I thought it was just innocent flirting, but then he pulled the phone from his pocket and showed me photos, texts, proof of encounters in hotels when Robert was supposedly on business trips to buy supplies for the B&B, and Sarah was visiting vendors for her new restaurant. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, feeling rage mixed with my grief. "I wanted to be absolutely sure," Richard said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of his father. "And then, When I was sure, I thought, I thought maybe it would be better if you never knew, that maybe we could move on. I already privately ended things with Sarah, but we decided to keep up appearances until after what was supposed to be our wedding, to avoid a scandal that would hurt the B&B. But then what? I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then I found out something worse, Richard said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Something that involves the B&B, its finances, and a plan they have to get us out of here. The world around me started to spin. 43-year charges of marriage, a whole life built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. And it was all crumbling before my eyes on a single September morning. Tell me everything, I said, wiping away tears with the back of my hand. Don't hide anything else from me. I need to know exactly what we're fighting against. And so, as the sun rose over the mountains of Vermont, and the guests began to wake up in the B&B we built with so much love, my son revealed the extent of the betrayal that threatened to destroy not only my marriage, but everything we had built over a lifetime. Richard led me to the office in the back of the B&B, away from the main house where Robert and Sarah remained. My legs felt heavy, as if I were walking through quicksand. The office was small but cozy, with a view of the gardens that I cultivated with so much care. How many hours had I spent in there, organizing reservations, planning menus, calculating expenses? This space that had always been my sanctuary now felt strange, as if it belonged to another life, another person. Richard closed the door softly and pulled a large envelope from the drawer that was usually locked. I never opened it. It was his workspace where he kept documents related to the future restaurant he planned to open after the wedding. "Sit down, Mum," he said gently, pulling a chair closer to me. His hands were trembling slightly, betraying the calm he was trying to maintain. Inside the envelope were dozens of documents, bank statements, contracts, business proposals, printed emails. Richard spread them out methodically on the table as I watched, my stomach clenching in anticipation. It all started when I noticed that Sarah was extremely interested in the B&B's finances, he began, his voice controlled. At first, I thought it was just professional interest, a chef wanting to learn about the business. But then I realized she was asking very specific questions about the property deeds, the loan contracts, and even the insurance policies. He showed me a copy of the original deed to the B&B. The property had been bought in Robert and my names more than 30 years ago, when it was still just an old, abandoned farmhouse that we transformed with our own hands. "Dad has been altering documents, Mum. He opened a company in his name 2 years ago, without including you, and started transferring properties to this new company." I felt the blood drain from my face. "How is that possible? I signed—" "No, you didn't," Richard interrupted softly, placing a stack of documents in front of me with what looked like my signature. "He forged your signature. Look closely." I examined the papers, feeling my world fall apart even more. The signatures were almost perfect, but there were small differences that only I would notice. The way I curved the E in Ellen, the pressure of the pen on the paper. "Why would he do that?" I whispered, unable to comprehend the depth of this betrayal. Richard sighed deeply before continuing. "Sarah isn't who we thought she was. She was never a chef in Italy. In fact, she worked for a real estate development firm that specializes in acquiring historic properties to convert into luxury developments." He showed me photos of Sarah at corporate events, wearing business suits instead of the chef's aprons I had seen her wear when visiting our restaurant. "They plan to sell the B&B, Mum. There's a proposal from an international hotel chain interested in this land. The value is astronomical." I looked at the document he showed me, a purchase proposal for $8.5 million. "But But the B&B is our life, I murmured, feeling dizzy. It's everything we built together. For you and me, yes, Richard said, his voice bitter. For Dad, apparently it's just an asset to be liquidated. And the wedding? I asked. The reality hit me in successive waves. Was it all a sham? Richard nodded slowly. Sarah met me in Italy, but it wasn't by chance. She was sent to get close to me when the development firm found out about the B&B. The plan was simple. Marry me to get legal access to the family, help Dad transfer the assets to the new company without raising suspicion, and then, after the divorce, split the profits from the sale. And your father? I asked, barely able to get the words out. How did he get involved in this? I'm not sure when the romance started, Richard said, avoiding my gaze. But from the messages I found, it seems that Sarah approached him first with the business proposal, and then things evolved. I think he was already dissatisfied, maybe bored with life here, dreaming of a luxurious retirement somewhere sunny. I remembered how Robert had often talked about friends who had sold their businesses and moved to the coast or abroad. How he would sigh when he saw reports about resorts on tropical beaches. I always considered these comments harmless dreams, never imagining they could be the seeds of a real plan. And you discovered all this? 3 months ago, Richard completed. I found a document on Sarah's laptop when she left it open. It was a report for her superiors at the development firm detailing the progress of the Mountain View Inn project. There were photos of me, of you, of Dad, detailed descriptions of our routine, of the inn's finances. It looked like a spy dossier. I closed my eyes, trying to absorb the shock of each new revelation. This wasn't just a matter of marital infidelity. It was an elaborate conspiracy to steal not only my husband, but also our family's legacy. What did you do when you found out? I asked. I confronted Sarah, Richard said, running a hand through his hair nervously. She denied it at first, but when I showed her the proof, she changed tactics. She offered me a share in the deal. She said I could make a lot of money, start a new life, open my own restaurant anywhere in the world. And Dad? Did you confront him too? Richard shook his head. I didn't have the courage, he admitted, with shame in his voice. I kept up appearances with Sarah, pretending I was considering her proposal, to buy time while I gathered more evidence and tried to figure out how to protect you and the B&B. I planned to call off the wedding at the last minute, claiming personal doubts, but I never imagined that you would find out. Not like this. I looked out the office window, toward the B&B that Robert and I built with so much love. Every stone, every floorboard, every rose in the garden told the story of our love, of our work together. Or at least, that's what I thought. What do we do now? I asked, feeling a cold determination replace the initial shock. Richard looked at me with surprise. Maybe he expected me to completely fall apart. Mum, we still have time, he said, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The final property transfer is scheduled for after the wedding. Technically, the B&B is still ours, if we act fast. Then we'll act, I interrupted, straightening my posture. First, we need to talk to a lawyer. Today. I have a friend who specializes in real estate law, Richard replied promptly. We can meet him discreetly in the city. Good, I nodded. In the meantime, we need to act like nothing has happened. They can't know we found out. Richard looked at me with a mix of admiration and concern. Can you do that? Face Dad and Sarah knowing what you know? I took a deep breath, feeling a strength I didn't know I possessed. For 43 years I've taken care of this family and this business. I won't let them destroy everything now. At that moment, we heard footsteps approaching the office. Quickly, Richard gathered the documents and put them back in the envelope, returning it to the locked drawer. The door opened, and there was Robert, my husband, the man I had loved for more than 4 decades, smiling as if nothing were wrong. "Ah, there you are," he said casually. "The guests are asking about breakfast, Ellen." I forced a smile, a mask I never imagined I would need to wear with him. "I'm on my way, honey," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. "I was just going over some wedding details with Richard." Robert nodded, his gaze briefly meeting Richard's before returning to me. Was there suspicion in those eyes I knew so well, or was it just my imagination? "Don't be long," he said, closing the door as he left. Richard and I remained silent for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade away. "The game starts now," I murmured, getting up and adjusting my apron. "Only now we're playing too." The rest of that day passed in a fever dream. I served breakfast to the guests with an automatic smile, answered questions about local attractions, and predicted the weather as I always did, all while watching Robert and Sarah interact with others. Small glances, seemingly innocent touches, secret signals I had never noticed before, but which now seemed obvious. How could I have been so blind? How could I not have noticed that my own husband, the man I had shared a bed with for more than 4 decades, was living a double life right under my nose? At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the B&B was temporarily empty as the guests went out to explore the town, Richard and I discreetly slipped away. We told Robert we were going to check on the floral arrangements for the wedding, another lie to add to the web of deceit that now enveloped our family. The lawyer's office, Mr. David Miller, was in an old building in downtown Vermont. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a serious expression. He listened to our story with professional attention, occasionally taking notes or asking for clarification. "Mrs. Ellen," he said finally, after we had finished laying out the situation and presenting the documents that Richard had gathered, "what your husband did constitutes fraud and forgery. The property transfers made with your forged signature can be challenged and nullified." "How long would that take?" I asked. "Court proceedings can take years," he admitted. "However, we can request immediate injunctions to prevent any additional property transfers." "And what about the money he already siphoned off?" Richard asked. Mr. Miller sighed. "Tracing and recovering diverted funds is complicated, especially if they were transferred to offshore accounts or converted into other assets." I felt a pang of despair. "So what do you suggest we do?" "The quickest approach," he said slowly, "would be to confront him with the evidence and negotiate a settlement. With what we have here, he would face serious criminal consequences. This can give you a strong position to negotiate." "I don't want to negotiate," I replied firmly. "I want my B&B back. I want to protect what we built." Mr. Miller, Mr. Miller looked at me with a mix of admiration and concern. "I understand, Mrs. Ellen. In that case, we need to act quickly and strategically." He then outlined a plan of action. First, we would file a formal complaint of fraud with the authorities. Simultaneously, we would initiate court orders to freeze all assets of the company Robert created and block any transactions involving the B&B. "This will create a legal obstacle that will prevent the sale," he explained. "No serious buyer would go ahead with a property tangled in litigation." "And what about the wedding?" I asked, looking at Richard. "It's scheduled for 2 weeks from now." "I'm not marrying her," Richard stated flatly. "But maybe we should keep up appearances until we have all the legal measures in place." Mr. Miller considered for a moment. "Postponing would be more prudent than abruptly cancelling. A cancellation could alert them that something is wrong." I nodded, feeling the weight of 2 more weeks of pretending to be normal. "And what about the police? Should we involve them now?" "I'll prepare the complaint today," the lawyer replied. But the police investigation can take time. Our immediate priority is to protect the property. When we left the office 2 hours later, we carried a folder full of documents to sign and a detailed plan. The Vermont sky, usually so blue, was covered by heavy clouds that promised rain. "Are you okay, Mom?" Richard asked as we walked to the car. "No," I replied honestly, "but I will be." He squeezed my hand. "We'll get through this together." Back at the B&B, we found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing what looked like a tasting for the wedding menu. When she saw us, she smiled brightly. "Ah, you're back. Come try this sauce I'm developing for the main course." I watched her with new eyes. Her beauty, which I had once admired innocently, now seemed calculated and predatory. Her Italian accent, which we found so charming, sounded fake and rehearsed. How did I not see it before? "It looks delicious," I said, forcing a smile as I tried a spoonful of the sauce she offered. "You're very talented, Sarah." "Thank you, Mrs. Ellen," she replied, seeming genuinely pleased with the compliment. She was a consummate actress. "I want everything to be perfect for our big day." Our big day. The words echoed in my mind like an insult. "Speaking of that," Richard said, playing his part with surprising ease, "we were thinking of postponing the wedding for a few weeks." Sarah's smile wavered for an instant. "Postpone? But why? Everything is practically ready." "Aunt Carol took a fall," I quickly invented. "She's in the hospital in the city. Since she's Richard's godmother, we'd like her to be able to be there." Sarah frowned, clearly annoyed, but keeping her composure. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Of course, we can consider a small postponement. We'll need to talk to the vendors, of course." "I'll handle it," Richard offered. "It wouldn't be more than a month, would it?" Before Sarah could respond, Robert came into the kitchen. He was wearing the blue sweater I had knitted for him last winter. Seeing him wearing something my hands had created with so much love caused a sharp pain in my chest. "What's everyone doing in here?" he asked jovially. This smells wonderful, Sarah." His eyes met hers briefly, and I saw what I had never noticed before. That complicit look, that silent communication between lovers. "Richard is thinking of postponing the wedding," Sarah informed him, her voice controlled but with a trace of tension. "Aunt Carol had an accident." Robert turned to Richard, surprise and something else, alarm in his eyes. "Really, that's the first I'm hearing of it. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "We just got the call when we were in town," Richard replied calmly. "It's nothing serious, but she'll need a few weeks to recover." Robert studied his son's face for a moment that was a little too long before nodding slowly. "Of course, it makes sense to wait. Carol was always like a second mother to you." The air in the kitchen grew thick with unspoken lies. I pretended to be busy wiping an already spotless countertop, unable to look directly at Robert. How could he be there, discussing the details of his son's fake wedding with his mistress, while planning to destroy everything we had built? "I'm going to go check the rooms," I announced abruptly, needing to escape from that charade before my facade crumbled. As I left the kitchen, I heard Sarah say in a low voice, "She seems strange today. Do you think she suspects something?" I didn't wait to hear Robert's answer. I hurried up the stairs, taking refuge in the room we shared, the room where, for decades, I believed I slept next to a man who loved me as much as I loved him. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally let the tears fall. Not just for the deception, but for the loss of what I thought we had. For the slow, silent death of a marriage that had defined who I was for most of my adult life. As the rain finally began to fall outside, washing the windows as if trying to clean the world, I cried for the end of my last autumn with Robert. The days that followed were a masterpiece of self-control. Every meal shared with Robert, every forced smile for Sarah, every casual conversation about the future. It all consumed me inside, but I kept the facade perfectly intact. At the same time, Richard and I worked discreetly with Mr. Miller to put our plan into action. The documents were filed with the court the following Monday. Injunctions were requested to block any transactions involving the B&B. My name was removed as a signatory from all joint bank accounts, preventing Robert from continuing to use my forged signature. The formal fraud complaint was filed with the police. In the meantime, life at the B&B went on. Guests came and went, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath the surface of our apparent family harmony. Sarah continued her wedding preparations, seemingly accepting the postponement, though I noticed her growing unease. She made frequent private calls, always speaking in a low voice. One afternoon, 7 days after our discovery, I was organizing sheets in the linen closet when I heard voices coming from the guest room. The door was closed, but the walls of the old house weren't as thick as Robert and Sarah seemed to believe. "They're acting weird," Sarah was saying, her voice tight. "I'm sure something is wrong." "You're imagining things," Robert replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Ellen has always been spacey, and as for Richard, he's just nervous about the wedding." "It's not just that," Sarah insisted. "Yesterday I saw Richard putting away documents when I went into the office. He looked guilty." "What do you want me to do?" The irritation was evident in Robert's voice. "Accuse my own son of conspiring against us?" "I think we should accelerate the plan," Sarah said after a moment of silence. "The buyers are getting impatient. If we wait much longer, they might back out of the deal." "And the wedding?" "To hell with the wedding. It was just a means to an end. We can cancel it, invent some excuse. The important thing is to finalize the sale before something goes wrong." My heart raced. They were planning to act faster than we had anticipated. I quietly moved away from the closet and went downstairs to find Richard, who was going through the reservation book at the front desk. "We need to call Mr. Miller now," I whispered after telling him what I had heard. "They're going to try to sell the B&B immediately." Richard grabbed the phone and stepped outside to make the call privately. He came back 15 minutes later, the relief visible on his face. "The injunctions were approved this morning," he informed me in a low voice. "The B&B is officially under legal dispute. Any attempt to sell will be automatically invalidated." "And the police investigation?" "Still ongoing, but Mr. Miller said the detective wants to meet with us tomorrow to take our formal statements." I nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. "So we're protected for now?" "Yes, but we need to be careful. If they realize we know, they'll run away with everything they've stolen so far," I completed. That night, we all had dinner together in the B&B's kitchen after closing, as we sometimes did. I had made pot roast with potatoes, Robert's favourite dish. It was surreal to lovingly serve the man who was planning to betray me in every possible way. "This is delicious, Ellen," Robert praised, savouring the dish as if nothing were wrong, as if he weren't living a lie. "Thanks," I replied automatically. "Your mother's recipe." Sarah watched our interaction with attentive eyes. "You two have such a sweet story together," she commented, her voice sweet as poison. 43 years. I can't imagine knowing someone for that long." "It's a lifetime," I agreed, meeting her eyes. "We built every piece of this B&B together, brick by brick. There's so much of us in here that sometimes I think the walls themselves hold our memories." I saw a slight discomfort pass over Robert's face. Was he feeling guilty, or just irritated by my inconvenient sentimentality? "Speaking of the B&B," he said, changing the subject, I was thinking maybe it's time to do some renovations, modernize a bit, maybe expand. My eyes briefly met Richard's. This was it, the beginning of the trap. What kind of renovations? I asked innocently, serving myself a little more salad. Nothing drastic, Robert replied, gesturing vaguely with his fork. But I've been talking to some investors interested in properties in the region. Tourism in Vermont is growing, and we could capitalize on that with some strategic upgrades. Investors? I repeated, keeping my voice neutral as my heart rate picked up. That's new to me. Just preliminary talks, he quickly replied. Nothing concrete yet. Sarah chimed in with artificial enthusiasm. It would be wonderful to modernize this place. Keep the rustic charm, of course, but add some luxury amenities, spas, maybe a heated pool. A pool would completely change the character of the B&B, I observed calmly. We've always prided ourselves on offering an authentic mountain experience, not a generic resort. Times change, Mum, Sarah said, with a slightly condescending tone that made my fingers grip the fork tighter. Today's tourists want comfort and luxury, even in rustic destinations. It's interesting that you're so sure about what tourists want, I replied, allowing a little of my true voice to show through. Considering you're a chef, not a hospitality specialist. A brief, awkward silence fell over the table. Richard cleared his throat. Actually, I was thinking, he said, getting in on the act, that maybe we should consider having the B&B registered as a historical landmark. The building is more than 100 years old, and that could give us tax benefits, as well as protect its original architecture. I saw the momentary panic in Robert and Sarah's eyes before they both controlled their expressions. A historical landmark? Robert shook his head. That would come with all kinds of restrictions on what we can do with the property. It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare. I think it's a fascinating idea, I insisted, supporting my son. After all, we want to preserve what we built here, don't we? For future generations. Robert looked at me for a long time, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the man I used to love. A hesitation, maybe even regret. But it disappeared so quickly that I questioned if it had ever really existed. Sure, he said finally. We can explore all the options. After dinner, while Sarah offered to do the dishes, another small part in her elaborate performance as the perfect daughter-in-law, Robert asked me to take a walk in the garden. The night was cold, and stars dotted the dark sky over the mountains. You've been distant lately, he commented as we walked among the rose bushes I had planted decades ago. Have I? I replied, watching my breath form little clouds in the cold air. Maybe I'm just tired. Planning a wedding is exhausting. It's more than that. He stopped, turning to face me. In the faint moonlight, his face looked older, more marked by the lines of time. You're different, more reserved. People change, Robert, I replied softly. Sometimes we find things out that change us. What things? There was a note of apprehension in his voice now. For a moment, I considered confronting him right there, in the garden I planted with my own hands, to rip off the mask and force him to face his lies. But it wasn't the right time. The plan wasn't complete. Nothing specific, I replied, turning my gaze to the distant mountains. Just the weight of the years, maybe, makes us think about what really matters in life. He nodded slowly, seeming momentarily relieved, but still suspicious. You know I love you, don't you? The words that for so many decades had been my comfort and joy now sounded hollow and false. It was like hearing an actor reciting his lines poorly. I know, I lied, the words bitter on my tongue. That night, lying next to Robert in the bed we had shared for almost half a century, I stayed awake, listening to his breathing. How was it possible for him to sleep so peacefully next to someone while planning to destroy everything that person loved? What kind of emptiness existed inside him that allowed for such duplicity? And even more disturbing, what did it say about me that I hadn't perceived the falsehood growing beside me all these years? The next morning, Richard and I left early for our meeting with Detective Rodriguez at the local police station. He was a stocky man with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested he had already seen every type of human deception imaginable. Forgery, document fraud, siphoning of assets, he listed after examining our documents. We have enough elements to initiate a formal investigation. How long will that take? I asked, aware that time was running out. Financial investigations are complex, Mrs. Ellen, he replied honestly. They would normally take weeks, maybe months, but considering the circumstances and the possibility that the suspects might try to leave the country, we can expedite the process. They plan to finalize the sale soon, Richard informed him. Possibly in the next few days. The detective nodded gravely. In that case, we'll need to act fast. I have two options for you. He explained that we could proceed with the most cautious approach, continue the investigation discreetly, gathering more evidence to build a stronger case. Or we could opt for an immediate intervention, with the police showing up at the B&B to formally notify Robert and Sarah that their activities were being investigated. The second option could alert them, cause them to destroy evidence or try to flee, the detective warned. On the other hand, it could prevent them from completing the sale. Richard and I looked at each other, weighing our options. I think we already have court orders blocking any property transactions, I said finally. Yes, the detective confirmed, but determined people can find loopholes, fake documents, unregistered transfers. I've seen it all. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. On one hand, the idea of Robert and Sarah being officially confronted for their actions had a certain appeal, a form of immediate justice. On the other, if they were alerted prematurely, they could escape with the money they had already siphoned off. We'll continue with the discreet investigation, I finally decided, but with maximum urgency. In the meantime, we'll keep up the charade at home. Are you sure you can, Mum? Richard asked, concern evident in his voice. Continue to live with them, pretending you don't know anything. I built that B&B with my own hands, I replied, raising my chin. I can endure a few more days of lies to save it. On the way back, Richard drove in silence, lost in his own thoughts. The mountains around Vermont were partially covered in fog, creating an ethereal and melancholy landscape that perfectly matched my mood. What are you thinking about? I asked finally. Richard sighed deeply. How you never really know people, not even the ones closest to you. Your father wasn't always like this, I said, surprising myself with my own need to defend the man who had betrayed me so completely. There was a time when he truly loved the B&B, when the dream was as much his as it was mine. When do you think he changed? I reflected on the question, trying to pinpoint the moment my husband began to drift away, to dream of another life. Maybe when the B&B really started to succeed, about 5 years ago, I replied slowly. Paradoxically, the more we prospered, the less satisfied he seemed, as if the dream, once realized, had lost its luster. Richard nodded in understanding. And Sarah, how did you not notice anything? The question hurt, but it was fair. How did I not see the betrayal happening right under my nose? I think when you live with someone for so long, you start to see them through a lens you created yourself, I answered after a moment. You no longer see the real person, but the version of them that exists in your mind. And as for Sarah, I shook my head. She played the part of the loving daughter-in-law perfectly. I wanted to believe that you had found someone special. When we arrived at the B&B, we found an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. Richard and I exchanged apprehensive glances before going inside. In the living room, Robert was sitting with two men in suits, documents scattered across the coffee table. When he saw us, he quickly got up, a look of guilty surprise on his face. "Ellen! Richard! I wasn't expecting you back so soon." "Clearly," I replied, looking at the papers on the table. "Are we interrupting something?" One of the men, tall, with perfectly groomed grey hair and an impeccable suit, stood up and extended his hand. "Mrs. Davis, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Mark Reynolds, from Horizon Ventures." I shook his hand mechanically, feeling a chill. Horizon Ventures? "Yes, we were discussing some investment possibilities for the property," he explained smoothly. "Your husband mentioned you were considering a substantial renovation." "Oh, really?" I looked directly at Robert, who seemed to be trying to communicate something with his eyes, a silent plea for me to play along. "How interesting. I don't recall us finalizing that decision." The second man, younger and with a calculating expression, chimed in. "In fact, ma'am, we're proposing a full partnership. Horizon would assume management of the property, transforming it into a luxury boutique resort, while you would maintain a minority stake." "A minority stake?" I repeated slowly. "In the B&B I built from scratch." The air in the room grew tense. Richard stepped closer, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "Gentlemen," he said with a surprising calm, "I appreciate the interest in our family business, but I'm afraid there's a misunderstanding. The B&B is not for sale, nor are we looking for outside partners at this time." Mark Reynolds seemed genuinely surprised. "Your father led us to believe the family was united in this decision." "My father," Richard replied coldly, "does not speak for the entire family." Robert shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this confrontation. "Richard, Ellen, can we discuss this in private? Mr. Reynolds and Mr. Mendoza travelled from the city especially for this meeting." "I apologize for the inconvenience," I replied, my voice firm. "But as my son said, there is nothing to discuss. The B&B is not for sale." At that moment, Sarah entered the room, looking momentarily flustered to see Richard and me there. She quickly recovered, smiling gracefully. "Oh, you've met the representatives from Horizon. Isn't it a fascinating proposal?" The naturalness with which she inserted herself into the conversation, assuming the role of a co-owner with the right to an opinion on the B&B's future, lit a fire inside me. A rage that had been slowly simmering now threatened to turn into an open flame. "Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "why don't you show the gentlemen our garden while I prepare some coffee? I'm sure they'd like to see the property before they leave." She hesitated, her eyes darting to Robert, who nodded discreetly. "Of course," she replied, regaining her composure. "This way, gentlemen." As soon as they left, I turned to Robert, not even bothering to hide my fury. "How dare you try to sell our B&B behind my back?" Robert held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Ellen, it's not what it looks like. We're just exploring options. Nothing has been decided." "Don't you lie to me." The words came out louder than I intended. "You talked about a minority stake. That's not exploring options. That's negotiating the sale of our home." Richard stepped between us, always the peacemaker. "Dad, what's really going on here?" Robert ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly much older and more tired. "It's complicated." "Then explain," Richard demanded, "because it looks pretty simple from our point of view. You're trying to sell the B&B without consulting Mum, the legal co-owner." For a moment, I thought Robert was going to confess everything. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the weight of the lies finally becoming too heavy. But then, like a curtain closing, the vulnerability disappeared, replaced by a cold determination. "I'm doing what's best for all of us," he declared. "This B&B has been a drain on our lives for decades. We're getting old, Ellen. I don't want to spend my last years changing sheets and fixing pipes." "So that's it?" I asked, incredulous. "You're tired, so you decide to throw away everything we built?" "It's not throwing it away," he insisted. "It's evolving. Horizon's proposal is generous. Enough money for us to retire comfortably, maybe even buy that house on the beach you always wanted." I shook my head, amazed by his ability to distort reality. "I never wanted a house on the beach, Robert. That was always your dream, not mine." Our eyes met, and in that moment I realized the extent of the chasm that had formed between us. It wasn't just about the infidelity or the financial conspiracy. It was about the fact that after 43 years together, my husband didn't really know me. "This conversation isn't over," I said finally, composing myself. "But for now, we have guests to attend to. Unwanted guests, but guests nonetheless." I walked to the kitchen to prepare the promised coffee, leaving Robert and Richard built in a tense silence. As the water boiled, I looked out the window to the garden, where Sarah was proudly showing the rose bushes to the Horizon executives. Rose bushes that I had planted, watered, and pruned over decades. The ease with which she claimed my work, my life, as if they were her own, was astonishing. In that moment, I made a decision. The time for pretending was over. It was time to end this game once and for all. The days that followed were filled with almost unbearable tension. After the departure of the Horizon executives, who left visibly confused by the mixed messages they received from the family, the pretense of normalcy became even more difficult. Robert was nervous, constantly checking his phone and making private calls. Sarah alternated between being overly solicitous with me and being distant, spending long periods locked in the guest room. Richard and I maintained constant contact with Mr. Miller and Detective Rodriguez. The investigation was moving quickly, with forensic experts analyzing the forged documents and tracing the suspicious financial transfers. Secret offshore bank accounts were discovered, concrete evidence of Robert's long-term plan. On the fourth day after the confrontation with the Horizon executives, I received a call from Mr. Miller while I was in town buying supplies for the B&B. "Mrs. Ellen," he said, his voice urgent, "we believe your husband and Ms. Smith are planning to leave the country." My heart raced. "How do you know?" "Our investigators found tickets bought in their names for flights to London, departing tomorrow night, and there was a large transfer from one of the offshore accounts to a British bank this morning." "They're fleeing," I whispered, grabbing the shopping cart to steady myself. "I'm afraid so. Detective Rodriguez is preparing arrest warrants, but they won't be ready until tomorrow. If they suspect we're closing in, they'll disappear today," I completed, the reality of the situation hitting me like a punch. "What should I do?" "Go back home and act normally," he instructed. "Don't let it show that you know anything. Detective Rodriguez is sending a plainclothes officer to watch the B&B discreetly, in case they try to leave before we can execute the warrants." I finished my shopping mechanically, my mind racing to process what was happening. Robert had not only betrayed me emotionally and financially, he planned to abandon me completely, fleeing to another country with my son's fiancée and the money we had built together over a lifetime. Upon returning to the B&B, I found a scene of apparent normalcy. Robert was at the front desk, checking in a couple of newly arrived guests. Sarah was in the kitchen, seemingly preparing something for dinner. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, except for the fact that it was all completely fake. "I need your help with the bags," Robert said when he saw me, smiling at the guests. "Our new friends will be staying in the blue room." I nodded, forcing a smile while I carefully watched his behavior. There was a nervous energy about him, a glint in his eyes that I recognized from other times when he was particularly anxious about something. We walked toward the room, carrying the couple's luggage. When we were alone in the hallway, Robert turned to me. "I was thinking of going out for dinner tonight," he said casually. "Just the two of us. It's been a while since we had a moment alone." The unexpected invitation took me by surprise. For an instant, I almost believed it could be genuine, maybe a last fragment of the man I loved trying to emerge. But then I remembered the tickets to London, the bank transfer, the systematic betrayal. "That would be lovely," I replied, equally casual. "But we have guests arriving early tomorrow. Maybe another day?" I saw a flash of frustration in his eyes before he nodded, accepting my excuse. Was he trying to get me away from the B&B tonight? To facilitate some final preparations for their escape? That afternoon, I found Richard in the linen closet where we could talk without being overheard. I told him about the tickets and the bank transfer. "They're going to run," he concluded, confirming my fears. "Probably tonight, since the tickets are for tomorrow." "Your dad invited me out to dinner," I added. "I think he's trying to get me away from the B&B." Richard shook his head, disgust evident on his face. "We have to let Detective Rodriguez know." "I already did. He has an officer watching the property, but without the warrants, they can't do anything unless they see a crime being committed." "Then we have to catch them red-handed," Richard decided. "Tonight." We came up with a simple plan. I would pretend to change my mind about dinner, giving Robert and Sarah the impression that the B&B would be free for any preparations they needed to make. Richard would hide in the office, from where he could discreetly observe the main house. I would go out with Robert, but I would forget my purse, giving me an excuse to return unexpectedly. If we caught them trying to flee or removing documents, we would have witnesses and the plainclothes officer to confirm their intentions. As night approached, I felt a strange calm wash over me. After days of pretense and anguish, the idea that it would all be over soon, one way or another, brought a kind of peace. I dressed for dinner carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that Robert always complimented, applying light makeup, and pulling my grey hair into a simple bun. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. Who was this woman looking back at me? She looked simultaneously familiar and strange, the same brown eyes that had seen so much love and betrayal, the same mouth that smiled with joy and now was set with determination. "You'll survive this," I whispered to my reflection. "You've survived worse." Robert was waiting for me in the living room, dressed formally, with a bouquet of flowers in his hand. Roses from my own garden, I realized with a lump in my throat. "You look beautiful," he said, handing me the flowers. "Thank you," I replied, accepting them mechanically. "Let me put them in water before we go." In the kitchen, I found Sarah preparing something that smelled deliciously of garlic and wine. "You're going out?" she asked, smiling sweetly. "Have fun. Don't worry about a thing here. I'll take care of everything." "I'm sure you will," I thought bitterly, but just smiled in response. When Robert and I were approaching the front door, I staged my part. "Oh, I forgot my purse," I exclaimed. "Go start the car. I'll be right back." I rushed back to the room, grabbed my purse, and then made a wide detour to the office where Richard was hiding. "We're leaving now," I whispered. "Stay alert." He nodded, his face serious. "Be careful, Mum. If you sense anything strange, don't confront him alone." "I'm not going to confront him," I promised. "We'll just stick to the plan." The restaurant Robert chose was elegant and discreet, about a 20-minute drive from the B&B. During the drive, he seemed strangely nostalgic, recalling the B&B's early years, the difficulties we faced together, the moments of joy when we started to succeed. If I didn't know better, I'd say he was trying to say goodbye. We took a table in the corner, with candles and a bottle of red wine he ordered without consulting the menu. My favourite, I noted. The familiarity of the gesture hurt more than it should have. Ellen, he said, after the waiter served the wine, I know things have been complicated between us lately. Complicated, I repeated, keeping my tone neutral as I took a small sip of wine. That's one way to describe it. He sighed, running a hand through his grey hair, a gesture so familiar I felt a pang of nostalgia despite everything. I want you to know that, despite everything, the years we spent together were the best of my life. The sincerity in his voice almost made me falter. Almost. How convenient that you mention that now, I replied, placing my glass on the table with a little more force than necessary. After spending months planning to sell our B&B behind my back. He looked genuinely surprised by my frankness. Ellen, it's not that simple. Then explain it to me, I challenged. Explain why you're trying to destroy everything we built together. He looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation in a public place. This isn't the place for that discussion. When would be the right place, Robert? After you finalized the sale? Or maybe after you fled to London with the money? His pupils dilated in shock. For a moment he seemed completely speechless. Then, slowly, understanding replaced the surprise on his face. You know, he said finally, not as a question, but as a statement. I know everything, I confirmed, keeping my voice low but firm. About Sarah, about the shell company you created, about the bank transfers, the forgeries, the plans to sell the B&B, and about the tickets to London for tomorrow night. He paled, visibly, his hand trembling around the wine glass. What does it matter now? I asked. The point is, it's over, Robert. At this very moment, the police are preparing arrest warrants for you and Sarah. The accounts have been frozen. The B&B is under legal protection against any attempt to sell. He looked like a drowning man, desperately trying to find something to grab onto. Ellen, you don't understand. I was going to tell you everything eventually. I was going to give you a fair share. A fair share? I interrupted, incredulous. Of what is legally half mine. Of the B&B we built together with our blood, sweat, and tears. How generous of you. It was a mistake, he admitted, his voice cracking. I got lost somewhere. Don't you dare blame her, I warned. You're a grown man who made his own decisions, decisions that tore our family apart. He lowered his head, defeated. What do you want, Ellen? I want you to think about Richard, I replied firmly. Your son, who you were willing to abandon without a word. I want you to face the consequences of your actions like a man, not like a coward fleeing in the middle of the night. It's too late for that, he whispered. Things were set in motion that I can't simply undo. At that moment, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Richard. They're here. Sarah is packing. Police on the way. My heart raced. The message didn't make sense. Sarah should be alone at the B&B, not with them. Who else was there? I need to go to the bathroom, I said abruptly, getting up. In the private hallway near the restrooms, I called Richard. What's going on? I asked as soon as he answered. 2 men arrived 10 minutes ago, he replied, his voice tight and low. They're not the same ones from Horizon. Sarah greeted them as if she were expecting them. They're removing documents from the office and loading bags into their car. And the officer? I just alerted him. He called for backup, but he said not to interfere until they arrive. I'll be there in 15 minutes, I decided. Don't do anything reckless. I returned to the table, trying to control my expression. I need to get back to the B&B, I said, getting up and grabbing my purse. I forgot to leave important instructions for a late arriving guest tonight. Robert looked at me with suspicion. Now? In the middle of dinner? It's an emergency, I insisted. You can stay and finish your meal if you want. A somber understanding passed over his face. You know something is happening at the B&B right now, don't you? I didn't answer. I just looked at him firmly. I'm coming with you, he said, throwing his napkin on the table and calling the waiter to pay the bill. The drive back was tense and silent. Robert drove too fast, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. I looked out the window at the lights of the houses we passed, each one holding stories and lives we would never know. How many other marriages hid secrets as deep as ours? When we reached the entrance of the B&B, we saw the flashing lights of 2 police cars. Robert stopped abruptly, his face a mask of panic. Ellen, he pleaded, turning to me. It's not too late. We can fix this. Do you really believe that? I replied. Some things, once broken, can no longer be repaired. I got out of the car and walked toward the B&B, feeling Robert follow a few steps behind me. In the front yard, a chaotic scene was unfolding. Sarah was being placed in the back of a police car, while 2 men I had never seen before were handcuffed and leaning against another police car. Richard ran to meet me. Thank God you got back safely. They were taking everything, documents, money, even some of your jewelry. Jewelry? I repeated, confused. We found it in Sarah's room, Detective Rodriguez explained, approaching us. Apparently she's been taking your personal belongings for some time. I looked at the jewelry a police officer was holding in a plastic bag. The pearl necklace my mother gave me, the earrings Robert gave me on our 20th wedding anniversary, the ruby brooch that had belonged to my grandmother. Small personal treasures that meant so much more than their monetary value. Robert remained frozen, watching the scene with a look of horror. When Detective Rodriguez approached him, he offered no resistance. Robert Davis, the detective said formally, you are being arrested on suspicion of fraud, document forgery, and siphoning of assets. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read him his rights, Robert looked at me one last time. There was something in his eyes, not just fear or regret, but something deeper. Maybe the belated realization of what he had thrown away. I'm sorry, he murmured, as he was led to the patrol car. I stood there, in the garden I had cultivated for decades, watching my husband of 43 years being taken away by the police. The roses I had planted with so much love now bore witness to the end of my marriage. A cold breeze blew, making the flowers sway gently, as if saying goodbye. Richard put a protective arm around me. Are you okay, Mom? No, I replied honestly, but I will be. The months that followed were an emotional roller coaster. The case became a minor local scandal. The respected B&B owner betrayed by her husband, who conspired with her son's fake fiancé. Sarah was charged not only with fraud related to the B&B, but also with siphoning off funds from her old job. The 2 men caught at the B&B were her accomplices, hired to help with the escape and the transfer of the stolen goods. Robert, after realizing the extent of the evidence against him, made a deal with the prosecution, confessing to his crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence. I discovered that he had siphoned off almost $2 million over the years, hidden in offshore accounts. With the help of the lawyers and the justice system, we were able to recover most of the money. The divorce was finalized in record time, given the circumstances. The B&B remained entirely mine, as did the recovered funds. Robert was sentenced to 4 years in prison, of which he would likely serve less than 2 in a minimum security facility. One afternoon, about 6 months after that fateful night, I received a visit request at the B&B. It was Mary, Sarah's mother, an elegant woman who had never fully approved of her daughter's engagement to Richard. Receiving her on the B&B's patio was one of the strangest moments of my life. Two women united by the betrayal of their loved ones, sitting and having tea as if it were a normal social visit. "I wanted to apologize in person," she said, after a few moments of polite but tense conversation. "I never imagined Sarah was capable of something like that." "None of us truly knew the people we loved," I replied, surprised by the lack of bitterness in my voice. "That's perhaps the hardest lesson of all this." "She was always ambitious," Mary reflected, looking toward the garden. "Ever since she was a little girl. She always wanted more than we could give her. I thought time would teach her to value other things besides money and status, but—" Her voice broke, and I saw in her the same kind of pain I was carrying myself. The pain of discovering that someone we love deeply is capable of cruelty and deceit. "How is your son doing?" she finally asked. "Richard is doing well," I replied. "He took over the B&B's management with me. He's turning the pain into something constructive." What I didn't mention was that he had also started dating a young historian who often came to the region to research colonial architecture. A budding relationship, cautious but promising. Life went on in unexpected ways. "And you, Ellen?" Mary asked, her eyes meeting mine with a shared understanding. "How are you, really?" The question took me by surprise. In recent weeks, everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells around me, as if I were made of glass, avoiding touching my emotional wounds. It was refreshing to hear someone ask directly. "I'm figuring out who I am without him," I answered honestly. "It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. 43 years is a long time to define yourself as part of a couple." She nodded, understanding. "My husband passed away 12 years ago. I remember that feeling, like learning to walk again." We talked for a while longer, two women sharing experiences of loss and rebuilding. When she left, I felt a strange peace. There was something healing in sharing pain with someone who truly understood, even if that person was the mother of the woman who had tried to destroy my life. A year passed. The B&B not only survived the scandal but prospered. Our story, ironically, attracted a different type of tourist. People fascinated by the drama that had happened within those century-old walls. Initially, the morbid curiosity bothered me, but over time, I learned to accept that our story was now part of the B&B's history. One autumn afternoon, very similar to the one when it all began to fall apart, I received a letter. The envelope had the seal of the penitentiary where Robert was serving his sentence. My first inclination was to throw it away without opening it. But something stopped me. Maybe curiosity, maybe the need for closure. I took the letter to the rose garden, sitting on the bench where Robert and I used to watch the sunset in the B&B's early years. The rose bushes were now bigger and more vigorous than ever, as if they too had found new life after the storm. The letter was long and handwritten, the familiar script more shaky than I remembered. Robert was asking for forgiveness, not expecting to receive it. He explained how he had gradually gotten lost, how boredom and routine had made way for resentments that grew silently, how Sarah, with her youth and ambition, had represented not just desire, but a second chance, an escape from the mortality he was beginning to feel closing in. There were no justifications, only explanations. And at the end, a confession that touched me more deeply than I expected. Only now, sitting in a cell and looking at the same patch of sky every day, do I truly understand what I threw away. It wasn't just a marriage or a B&B, it was an entire lifetime of shared moments that I will never have again. The greatest punishment isn't the prison, Ellen, but knowing that I destroyed what really mattered, and that nothing I can do will ever bring that back. I folded the letter carefully, watching the sun begin to set behind the mountains. The shadows lengthened across the garden, creating complex patterns on the grass. I thought about forgiveness and how it comes in many forms. Sometimes, forgiving someone means freeing them from their guilt. Other times, it means freeing yourself from rage and bitterness, even if there is no reconciliation. I realized that I no longer hated Robert. The pain was still there. It probably always would be. But the hatred had dissipated, replaced by something closer to pity, not just for him, but for both of us. For all the years we could have had together, if he had made different choices. For the future we had planned, which would now follow separate paths. A gentle breeze rustled the rose bushes, spreading their perfume through the air. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. Autumn was coming to an end, giving way to winter. But after winter, spring would come, and with it, new flowers, new possibilities. I understood then that this was the true nature of starting over. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain never existed. It was about acknowledging it, carrying it as a part of who we become, and still moving forward, allowing new gardens to flourish where old ones were destroyed. I put the letter in my pocket and got up, ready to go back to the B&B. My B&B, where Richard would be waiting to discuss the expansion plans we had started to develop. The life I knew had ended one autumn, but another life, unexpected and still to be discovered, was just beginning, and this time, it would be entirely mine. Now, if you liked this story, click on the next video appearing on the screen, because in it, you'll find a story of betrayal and revenge like you've never seen before.